The most powerful underground empire on the West Coast didn't fall because of the police. It didn't fall because of rivals. And it didn't fall because of betrayal. It began to change because of one sentence from a 5-year-old child. On a sidewalk, in the middle of the night, Reid Ashford was a name no one in San Francisco dared to speak out loud. For 13 years, he built his empire on iron discipline and one rule that never changed: never get involved in anything that isn't your business. That night, his car stopped at a red light on a quiet intersection. He looked outside. A woman was limping down the sidewalk, holding her small daughter's hand. Every step she took was slow and heavy. The little girl held on to her mother, matching her pace, not crying, not complaining, just holding on. Reid signaled his driver to keep going, but the little girl turned around. She looked into the black car through the half-open window and said to her mother loud enough for him to hear, "Mommy, let's ask the man in that car to help you. Your foot hurts." One sentence from a 5-year-old child. That was all. But it sounded exactly like the voice of someone Reid had failed to save. If this story reached you, hit like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story. Reid sat motionless. His hand rested on the car door handle, but he didn't open it. The child's words still echoed through the narrow space inside the car, clear as if they had just been spoken again. "Mommy, let's ask that man to help you." He had heard those words before, not from this child. From someone else. Many years ago, in a room smaller than any room he had stepped into since then, his sister had said something almost the same. "Please, big brother, help me." Her voice had been small, filled with absolute trust, as though there wasn't a single thing in this world her brother couldn't do. Reid remembered the little hand clutching the sleeve of his coat. He remembered the feeling of those tiny fingers tightening, and he remembered that by the time he got there, that hand had already let go. She was gone. No one ever told him the exact moment it happened. He only knew that when he arrived, everything was already over. From that night on, Reid Ashford didn't allow himself to stop for anyone ever again. He turned every day into a chain of emotionless decisions. He built his organization on absolute rules. He became the kind of man no one dared approach without a reason. And for 13 years, that had worked. Until tonight. Tate sat in the front seat, watching him through the rearview mirror. He didn't ask. Tate never asked when Reid fell into this kind of silence. The kind of silence that made the whole car feel heavier than usual. The red light had turned green. The car behind them gave a soft honk. Tate still waited. Beyond the window, the woman was still walking. Each step was slower than the one before. Her left foot barely touched the ground, only brushing the sidewalk before lifting again at once. The child held on to her mother's hand, taking one small step at a time. Patient, not urging her, not asking questions, only moving at the pace she was able to keep. Reid watched the two of them, and something shifted inside him. Not violently, not clearly, just a small crack, enough for light to slip through a place he had sealed shut for 13 years. She was wearing the uniform of a harbor diner, the kind of night shift shirt Reid had seen on hundreds of laborers whenever his car passed through that district after business deals. But the uniform wasn't what made him stop. It was the child. At midnight, a 5-year-old shouldn't have been out on the street. If she was here, it meant there was no one to keep the girl at home. It meant this woman had no other choice except to bring her daughter with her. Reid opened the car door. Tate reacted at once, his hand brushing the steering wheel. "Ready." Reid said only 2 words. "Wait here." Then he stepped out. The night air was colder than it had been inside the car. The sound of his footsteps on the pavement rang clearly through the empty street. Ahead of him, the woman heard those footsteps and turned around. And instantly, she pulled the child behind her back. June stood close against the wall of a closed shop, her back angled slightly toward Bria, one hand keeping her child behind her. Her eyes looked straight at Reid, unblinking, not retreating, but not stepping forward either. It was the look of someone who had grown used to protecting herself in situations where no one stood on her side. Reid stopped a few steps away from the two of them. He didn't come any closer. He understood that if he moved nearer, this woman would only draw further into herself, and the child behind her would feel her mother's fear. So he stayed where he was. "Get in the car," he said. His voice wasn't loud, wasn't soft, only steady enough to be heard clearly in the empty street. "I'll have my driver take you home." June didn't answer at once. She looked at the black car idling in the street, its windows dark, the engine still running, then looked back at the man standing in front of her. The dark coat, the straight posture, the way he held his hands loosely at his sides, none of it looked like a kind stranger stopping to offer help. It looked like a man accustomed to giving orders. "I'm not used to taking favors from strangers," she said. Her voice was calm, but her left leg trembled slightly, the kind of tremor she tried to hide by shifting her weight onto her right side. Reid glanced down at her foot. She was standing unevenly, all her weight pressing onto one leg. Her left ankle was slightly swollen, enough for him to notice even beneath the dim streetlight. He didn't know how long she had been walking on it, but from the way the child clung to her mother's hand, patient and familiar with this pace, he guessed it hadn't been a short distance. "I didn't ask whether you're used to it or not," Reid said. "The child needs to get home. How much longer do you plan to walk on a leg like that?" The question hung between them. June didn't answer, but behind her back, Bria peeked out, looking at Reid with eyes that held no fear, only curiosity. Then she tipped her face up toward her mother. "Mommy, your leg hurts." It was a simple sentence. There was no attempt to persuade. It was only a 5-year-old child saying what she could see. But it placed June exactly where she didn't want to stand, at the place where her toughness collided with reality. She looked down at her daughter. Bria's shoulders were drawn in from the cold, her little hand still gripping her mother's tightly, her lips slightly pale beneath the yellow light. And June knew she could endure another hour, maybe 2. She had endured things far heavier than this, but Bria didn't need to endure it with her. June said nothing to Reid. She didn't thank him, didn't nod, didn't signal her agreement. She only tightened her hold on Bria's hand, then walked toward the car. She opened the back door herself. She helped her daughter in first. Then she got in on her own and pulled the door shut. Reid remained outside for another second, looking at the two of them through the glass. Then he got back into the car and took the front seat beside Tate. "Follow her directions," he said. Tate glanced into the rearview mirror, looking at the woman in the back seat, holding her daughter close, her back straight, her eyes fixed ahead, not looking at anyone. Tate didn't ask questions. He drove. Inside the car, no one spoke. The air carried that heavy kind of silence both adults understood. The silence of people who knew they were caught inside a situation that didn't belong to either of them. June sat upright, one arm around Bria, the other resting on her lap, her hand clenched tightly in the fabric of her pants. She didn't lean back against the seat. She sat like someone ready to open the door and step out at any moment. Reid didn't turn around to look at her. He sat in the front, his eyes on the road, but he knew she was watching, guarding, measuring. He could feel it. That sensation of being observed by a stranger with absolute caution. The kind of caution that didn't come from hatred, but from having been taught by life that free kindness usually came with some kind of price. Bria sat in her mother's lap, her eyes wide as she looked around the car. Leather seats, a clean interior, a scent utterly different from the street outside. She said nothing. She only looked, and in those 5-year-old eyes, everything was new. Everything was strange, but none of it was frightening. A few minutes into the drive, Bria spoke up. "What's your name, mister?" Her voice rang through the car as if the silence from before had never existed at all. June gave her daughter's hand a small squeeze, a quiet gesture meant to remind her to be still. But Bria didn't look at her mother. She was looking toward the front seat, toward where Reid was sitting, her eyes curious and patient as she waited for an answer. Reid didn't turn around. "Reid," he said, short, no last name, no explanation. "Reid," Bria repeated, pronouncing it a little wrong. "That's such a strange name." Tate glanced at the rearview mirror, the corner of his mouth shifting slightly, though it never became a smile. Reid didn't correct her. He simply stayed quiet, but Bria had no intention of stopping. "Mr. Reid, why are you out so late?" she asked next, her voice utterly natural, as if she were talking to someone familiar across a dinner table. "Work," Reid answered. "My mommy says that too whenever she works late," Bria said. "Mommy says she has work to do. Then she goes. Then she comes home in the morning. But when she gets home, she's always so tired." June drew in a soft breath. She said nothing, but the arm around her daughter tightened just a little more. She didn't want Bria telling those things to a stranger. But Bria was 5 years old, and to a child like her, there was no such thing as a detail too small to say aloud. "Who do you sleep with when your mother goes to work?" Reid asked. The question came out before he had time to wonder why he was asking it at all. "Miss Pearl," Bria answered quickly. "She lives next door to us. She gives me cake a lot. But today she got sick, so Mommy had to come get me early." So now he understood. The woman who watched the child had fallen ill. The mother had to leave her shift in the middle of it, pick up her daughter, walk home, and twist her ankle somewhere along the way. No one to help, no backup plan, only a woman on her own, trying to manage everything life had thrown at her. Reid said nothing more. He looked straight ahead, but in his mind, the pieces had already begun to settle into place. Bria sat quietly for a moment, tilting her head as she looked at the back of Reid's neck through the gap between the seats. Then she spoke again, her voice softer than before, as if she were saying something she had spent a long time thinking about, before finally letting it out. "You look sad." The car kept moving. Tate kept driving, but those words stayed hanging in the air, never falling away. Reid didn't answer. He didn't turn around. He didn't ask why she had said that. He just sat there, and those words went straight into the place he had kept locked for 13 years. Gently, without knocking, without asking permission, simply entering as if the door had already been opened. June bent her head and whispered into her daughter's ear, "Don't ask so many questions, sweetheart." Bria nodded, but her eyes were still fixed on the front, on the man she had just called by the wrong name, and yet somehow said the one true thing no one around him ever dared to say. The car turned onto a narrower street, with fewer streetlights, lower buildings, a neighborhood worn thinner by time. June looked outside, then spoke softly, just loud enough to be heard. The building at the mouth of the alley on the left. Tate slowed the car. It came to a stop in front of an old apartment building, its outer walls faded, its outdoor staircase lined with rusting iron rails. The light bulb on the second floor flickered, close to the end of its life. June opened the car door. She stepped out first, then turned and helped Bria down after her. Her leg still hurt, and the first step onto the ground made her wince for the briefest instant. But she let nothing more show. She took Bria's hand and started toward the stairs, her back straight, not looking back. After 3 steps, she stopped. She didn't turn around, only tilted her head slightly to one side, just enough for her voice to carry back toward the car. "Thank you." One word. Not warm, not cold, only enough to keep it from becoming a debt. Then she kept walking. Bria turned back to look at the car one more time, gave a small wave, then ran after her mother up the stairs. The apartment door opened, and warm light spilled out for one brief moment. Then the door closed again. Reid sat in the car, watching until the stairwell light finally went dark. "Go," he said. Tate drove the car back out of the alley. The city returned beyond the windows, brighter streetlights, wider roads, everything settling back into its familiar place. But Reid knew something inside him had shifted, only a little, but enough for him to know that it had moved. 3 days passed. Reid Ashford returned to the exact rhythm of life he had kept running for 13 years. In the mornings, he sat in the boardroom on the highest floor of the building he owned in the financial district, listening to reports from the people who managed the branches of his business empire. In the afternoons, he met with partners in private restaurants whose names didn't appear on any map. At night, he gave orders, approved, refused, cut ties. Everything moved with the precision of a machine whose every gear he had designed himself. No one noticed anything different about him, because on the surface, there was nothing different. Reid still spoke little, decided quickly, and looked at the person across from him with the kind of gaze most people couldn't hold for more than 3 seconds. But every night, when he sat alone in his penthouse looking out over San Francisco Bay, he found himself thinking about that intersection. Not the woman, not the child, but the feeling he had when he stepped onto the street, the moment he got out of the car, not for a deal, not for an order, not for anyone in his organization. For the first time in 13 years, he had done something that brought him no benefit at all, and the strange part was that it didn't make him feel weaker. It made him feel something he couldn't find a word for. On the 4th day, Reid called Tate into his private office. Tate stepped in, took his place across from the desk, and waited. He was used to this. Stand. Wait. Hear the order. Carry it out. The woman from that night, Reid said without looking up. Find out about her. Tate didn't ask which woman. He knew. From that night at the intersection, Tate had known something was different. Because in 13 years at Reid Ashford's side, He had never once seen Reid stop his car for a stranger. "Understood," Tate said, then walked out. 2 days later, Tate came back with a thin file. He didn't sit down. He simply stood in front of Reid's desk and read. June Holloway, 27 years old. Single mother. 1 5-year-old daughter named Bria. Husband died 3 years ago in a workplace accident at a construction site in Oakland. After his death, his family cut off contact. She has no family of her own left. She is still paying off hospital bills from when she gave birth, making monthly payments. At present, she works washing dishes on the night shift at Gentry Restaurant in the Harbor District, from 9 o'clock at night until 4 o'clock in the morning. No criminal record. No ties to any organization. Clean. Tate stopped. Reid said nothing. He sat there with both hands laced together on the desk, his eyes fixed on the empty space ahead. Not because he was thinking, but because he was hearing every detail again in his mind, and each one carried a kind of weight he wasn't used to. 27 years old. Single mother. Husband dead. Family abandoned her. Debt. Washing dishes through the night. And that night, on the sidewalk, she had still kept walking. Her leg hurt, her child beside her, no one helping, and she had still kept moving. No calling a car, no asking anyone, no crying, just walking. Reid remembered the way June had looked at him when he told her to get in the car. It hadn't been the look of gratitude. It hadn't been the look of pleading. It had been the look of someone so used to having no one help her that when somebody finally stopped, her first response wasn't relief. It was suspicion. He understood that look. He had seen it in the mirror many years ago, when he had still been a boy taking care of himself and his sister in neighborhoods where no one stopped for anyone. Tate was still standing there, waiting. He didn't ask Reid what he planned to do with the information. He didn't ask why Reid cared. Tate had worked with Reid long enough to know there were times when silence was the most complete answer of all. At last, Reid looked up. "All right," he said. Only 2 words. Tate nodded, set the file on the desk, and walked out. The door closed. The room fell silent again. Reid pulled the file closer and looked at the first page. There was no photograph, only words. But he didn't need a photograph. He still remembered exactly how she had stood. Her back straight, her leg in pain, her hand keeping her child behind her, her eyes fixed directly on him without retreating. He closed the file and pushed it aside. Then he turned toward the window and looked out over the city. San Francisco stretched below him, bright in the night. Millions of lights, millions of people, each one moving along a road of their own. And somewhere in that city, a 27-year-old woman was standing at a sink on the night shift, washing dishes, so that tomorrow morning she could go home and pick up her daughter before the sky was fully light. 4 nights later, Reid had the car stop 2 blocks away from Gentry Restaurant. He didn't tell Tate why. Tate didn't ask. The car sat with its lights off, motionless in the darkness of an alley running parallel to the main street, far enough to stay hidden, close enough to see the back door of the restaurant where the night shift workers came and went. At 4:12 in the morning, the back door opened. June stepped out, still in her diner uniform, a small bag in her hand, her shoulders slightly curved from exhaustion. She paused for a second outside the door, drew in a long breath, then began to walk. Her leg was better than it had been the last time. She no longer leaned completely to one side, but there was still a faint unevenness in her step, a small limp she tried to hide by walking faster than usual. Reid signaled to Tate. The car rolled slowly out of the alley and onto the main street, moving alongside the sidewalk where June was walking. The window came down. "Get in," Reid said. "You've still got a long way to go." June didn't stop walking. She didn't turn her head right away, but she recognized that voice. Short, even. The voice of a man more accustomed to giving orders than making offers. She glanced over, saw the black car, saw his face through the lowered window, and kept walking. "I'm not used to taking favors from strangers," she said, her eyes fixed straight ahead. "You said that last time," Reid replied. "Because it's still true," June answered, her voice steady. The car kept moving slowly beside her. Reid watched her walk, her back straight, her steps even, that slight limp she tried to control with every stride. She didn't look at him again. "I'm not used to offering twice," Reid said. "Then don't offer." The answer came quickly, sharp, without a second's hesitation. June Holloway wasn't the kind of woman who softened just because someone was patient. She had lived alone long enough to know that a man's patience usually came tied to expectation. and she had nothing to give in return for anyone's expectations. Reid said nothing more. He didn't tell Tate to stop the car or speed up. The car simply kept rolling beside her, holding the same distance, not closer, not farther away. The two of them moved forward in silence, one on the sidewalk, one inside the car, both rigid, both unwilling to yield. Then the rain began. Not a light rain. The first drops hit the pavement hard, and within seconds the whole street changed from silence to the sound of water. June stopped walking. She stood there as the rain began soaking into the shoulders of her thin work shirt, looking at the road ahead. Still far. She knew exactly how many steps remained before she would reach home, because she had counted them hundreds of times on nights before this one. The car was still beside her, the window still down, Reid still watching her. He didn't say another word. He didn't offer a third time. He didn't press. He just waited. June stood in the rain for 3 more seconds. Then she stepped down from the curb, opened the back door herself, got in by herself, and pulled the door shut, exactly like the last time. She didn't ask anyone to open the door for her. She never would. Inside the car, the smell of rain came in with her, mingling with the scent of dish soap and grease from the kitchen at the restaurant. June sat upright, her eyes facing forward, her hands resting on her lap, in the same guarded posture as before. She didn't say thank you. She didn't explain why she had changed her mind, and Reid didn't need her to do either of those things. The car moved on in silence. Tate drove along the familiar route he had memorized from the earlier night. No one needed to give directions. Rain struck the windows. The wipers moved back and forth in an even rhythm, and inside that narrow space, the two of them sat with only a row of seats between them. Yet it felt as though they were separated by an entire world. The car stopped in front of the apartment building. June opened the door and stepped out. The rain was still falling, but she didn't hurry. She stood outside the car and turned to look at Reid through the open frame of the door. "Don't come again," she said. Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't cold. It was only tired. Tired in the way of someone who had grown used to leaning on no one, and didn't want to begin that habit now. Reid looked at her. Rain soaked her hair and ran down the shoulders of her uniform shirt, but she stood there with her back straight, as if the sky above her were clear. He didn't answer. June closed the car door. She walked away, her back straight, without looking back. The apartment door opened and then closed again. Reid remained in the car for a few more seconds, looking at the door after it had shut, then said to Tate, "Home." The car rolled forward. The city drifted by beyond the windows, wet and blurred. Reid sat back where June had just been sitting, and he realized the seat was still warm. Reid didn't listen to June. On the third night after that, his car was parked again 2 blocks from Gentry Restaurant, lights off, waiting. At 4 o'clock in the morning, June stepped out, saw the familiar black car, and walked in the opposite direction. She took a route 2 blocks longer just so she wouldn't have to pass by his car. Reid didn't follow. He told Tate to drive home. The next night, he came again. June took the longer way again. Reid drove home again. No words, no explanation, no pressure. He simply came, waited, and accepted the result. And so a rhythm began to form between them, one that neither of them acknowledged existed. Reid came. June avoided him. Reid left. Then Reid came again. By the 5th night, June no longer took the longer route. She stepped out the back door of the restaurant, saw the car, paused for 1 second, then walked straight along the sidewalk on the shortest way home. She didn't get into the car, but she didn't avoid it anymore either. The car rolled slowly behind her, keeping its distance, not pressing, not inviting. It simply followed until she turned into the alley, climbed the stairs, and the apartment door closed behind her. Then the car left. It was the first night they moved through the city together without a single word being spoken, and somehow, it felt less tense than all the conversations before it. After that night, Reid began to change the way he was present. He didn't only wait outside the restaurant anymore. Sometimes, when his car passed by June's apartment building in the evening, he told Tate to stop for a few minutes. He would leave a bag of food at the apartment door. No name, no note, no knock. Just set it down and leave. The first time, the bag of food was still sitting at the door when June came home at nearly 5 o'clock in the morning. She looked at it, looked down the empty hallway, then looked back at the bag. She knew where it had come from. She didn't need to guess. She stood there for a few seconds, then bent down, picked it up, and carried it inside. No thank you, no contact, No acknowledgement. But she didn't throw it away either. After that, every few days, a bag of food would appear again. And every few days, it would disappear from the doorstep before morning came. No one spoke about it. It existed like an unspoken agreement between two people who didn't know each other, or didn't know each other yet, or were getting to know one another in a way neither of them had a name for. 2 weeks passed. Reid still came to the restaurant on nights when there wasn't an important deal to handle. He didn't come every night. Sometimes he stayed away for 2 or 3 days, but he came often enough that June knew when she stepped out the back door at 4 o'clock in the morning, there was always a chance that black car would be there. She grew used to that possibility. She didn't admit she had grown used to it, but she had. Then one night, it rained. June stepped out the back door of the restaurant and saw the car already waiting. The rain was heavy, the road slick with water. She stood beneath the restaurant awning, looking at the car, then at the long stretch of road ahead. She didn't need anyone to calculate it for her. She knew the walk home from here took 40 minutes when the weather was dry. In rain like this, nearly an hour. Her leg had healed, but nearly an hour of walking in the rain at 4 o'clock in the morning, after 8 hours of washing dishes, wasn't something anyone would choose if there was another option. June stepped out from under the awning, walked straight to the car, opened the back door herself, got in herself, and closed the door. She didn't wait for Reid to lower the window. She didn't wait for an invitation. She said nothing. Reid sat in the front seat and looked at her in the rearview mirror. He saw her sitting there, wet, tired, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes fixed ahead. There was no confrontation. No, don't come again. No resistance. There was only a tired woman getting into a car because she needed to go home, and she had stopped pretending that didn't matter. Reid noticed that change. He said nothing. He didn't turn around to look at her. He only gave Tate a slight nod, and the car began to roll forward. They rode in silence. No questions. No thank you. Nothing the outside world would have called a relationship. But there, inside the black car moving slowly through the empty streets of San Francisco at 4 o'clock in the morning, something was beginning to form. It had no name. It didn't need one. It was simply the presence of two people beside each other in silence, and both of them chose not to break it. That night, June got into the car and said nothing. She opened the door, sat down, closed it, then leaned her head against the window and shut her eyes. She wasn't asleep. Her body had simply reached a point where even keeping her eyes open had become an effort too wasteful to make. Tate drove the way he always did, slow, steady, without making a sound. The city drifted past outside in silence. Reid sat in the front seat, but his eyes weren't on the road. He was looking into the rearview mirror. June sat in the back, her head tilted against the glass, her eyes closed, both hands resting in her lap. Her fingers were slightly open, palms turned upward, as if even curling them shut had become too much. Reid looked at those hands. He had seen many hands in his life. Hands clenched tight across negotiating tables. Hands trembling in front of him during meetings no one ever wanted to speak about again. Hands raised to beg for mercy. Hands wrapped around whiskey glasses at false and glittering dinners. But these hands were different. The skin was dry, the fingertips rough from too many hours in water, calluses running along the palm exactly where her hand would grip a heavy scrubbing brush night after night. These were the hands of someone who worked without stopping. Not because she wanted to, but because she had no other choice. Reid looked at her longer than he should have. She was thinner than she had been the first night he saw her at that intersection. Back then he hadn't noticed because it had been dark, because everything had happened too fast. But now, under the low light inside the car, he could see it clearly. Her shoulder bones pushed sharply against the fabric of her uniform. Her wrists were smaller than they should have been. Her cheekbones were more pronounced. She was losing weight. And he had watched her for enough nights now to know this wasn't something that had happened in only a day or two. And in that moment, sitting in the black car in the middle of San Francisco, looking at a woman so exhausted she didn't even have the strength to keep her eyes open, Reid realized something he hadn't been prepared to realize. He was afraid. Not afraid in the way he understood fear. Not afraid of enemies, betrayal, or losing power. He had handled those things 1,000 times. This fear was different. It lay deeper, in the place he had buried and refused to let anyone touch for 13 years. He was afraid of losing her. Not losing her in the sense that she would vanish from the city, but losing her in the sense that she would collapse before anyone reached her in time to catch her. She was exhausted. She was growing thinner. She was working 2 shifts, raising a child alone, paying down debt, and refusing to let anyone help her. And Reid knew better than most that every human being has a limit, no matter how strong they are. Because once, long ago, he had stood beside someone who wouldn't stop, wouldn't ask for help, wouldn't allow herself to be weak, until everything ended before he had the chance to do anything at all. He didn't think of his sister. He refused to think of her. But the fear was the same. That feeling of watching someone run out from the inside and not knowing whether you had the right to do anything, that feeling was the same. "Pull over," Reid said it in a normal voice. Not louder, not lower. But Tate heard the difference. In 13 years, Tate had learned to read every shade in Reid's voice. And this tone, outwardly calm, but a fraction slower than usual, was one he almost never heard. The car stopped at the curb beneath a row of dark trees. Tate looked in the rearview mirror, then over at Reid. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Give me a minute," Reid said. Tate didn't ask anything else. He turned back to face forward, looking out at the street, and waited. Reid sat there, both hands resting on his thighs, his eyes fixed through the windshield into the darkness ahead. He didn't look at June again. He didn't need to. Her image was still there, sharp behind his eyes, the roughened hands, the jutting bones of her shoulders, her head leaning against the window as if the whole world had become too heavy. He drew in a slow breath, then let it out even more slowly. His jaw tightened. The muscles along his cheek hardened. His eyes stayed open, staring straight ahead without blinking, and they were red, not from crying. Reid Ashford didn't cry. He had forgotten how to cry on the night he lost the most important thing he had ever had. But his eyes were red. Red in the way the body reacts when the mind is trying to hold back something too large to swallow down. He sat there for a minute, maybe 2. Tate didn't count. In the back seat, June still had her eyes closed, her head still resting against the glass, her breathing even and slow. She didn't know the car had stopped. She didn't know the man in the front seat was sitting motionless, his eyes red, staring into the darkness and seeing nothing except the fear he had buried for 13 years now surging back to the surface. And perhaps because she didn't know, Reid allowed himself that moment. If she had opened her eyes, he would have swallowed it all back at once. He would have become Reid Ashford again, the man whose name no one in San Francisco dared speak lightly. But she didn't open her eyes. And in that short minute or two, inside the car standing still beneath those dark trees in the sleeping city, he allowed himself to be someone else, a man afraid of losing someone, a man still capable of fear. Then he drew in one last breath. Slow, deep. His eyes were still red, but his jaw had loosened. He gave Tate a slight nod. "Go." The car began moving again. June still slept, and Reid Ashford sat there in the familiar darkness, with a new crack inside him that he knew would never heal again. The next night, June didn't close her eyes. She got into the car as usual, shut the door, and took her place in the back seat. But instead of leaning her head against the glass and letting the city drift by in silence, she sat upright. Her eyes open, more alert than on any of the nights before, and for the first time, when she looked at Reid through the rearview mirror, it wasn't with caution, it was with curiosity. The car moved for a few minutes, passed 2 intersections, turned left at the familiar stretch of road Tate already knew by heart. Then June spoke. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was calm, not sharp like before. It wasn't a question meant to challenge. It was a question that truly wanted an answer. Reid didn't turn around. "Doing what?" "Coming here, waiting for me, driving me home," June said. "It's been almost a month. What do you get out of it?" "Nothing. No one does anything for nothing." The words came quickly, without hesitation. June Holloway was 27 years old, and 27 years had taught her that everything free came with a price. Free kindness usually came with the highest price of all. Reid was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice unchanged. "Then you work 2 shifts, wash dishes until your hands crack. What do you get?" June didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands. The calluses that had become a permanent part of her skin. The fingertips worn so rough, she could barely feel anything soft anymore. Then she said, "My daughter gets to eat." 3 words. She didn't explain further. She didn't talk about debt. She didn't talk about hospital bills. She didn't talk about the nights she stood at a sink until 4 in the morning and then went home to pick up her child before sunrise. She didn't need to. Those 3 words held everything. The car moved on in silence for a while, but this time, the silence was different. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't tense. It was simply a pause between two people who had started telling each other the truth and needed time to get used to how that felt. June looked out the window, watching the city slide past, then turned back. "Who are you?" she asked. "Really?" Reid met her eyes through the rearview mirror. For the first time in all the nights he had driven her home, their gazes locked through that small mirror. Not by accident. Both of them knew they were looking. "Someone you shouldn't know," he said. The answer came slower than his others, as if he were weighing truth against distance. Then he chose both. June didn't look surprised. She didn't ask what he did, didn't ask about organizations, didn't ask why his car always had a driver and tinted windows. She already knew. Maybe she had known from the first night, from the way the car had stopped at that intersection, from the way Tate had looked at her in the mirror with the eyes of someone trained to measure threat, from the way Reid had said, "Get in the car," like an order instead of an invitation. She wasn't naive. She had lived in this city long enough to know black cars didn't wait on the street at 4 a.m. for ordinary reasons. "I figured," she said. Her voice held no fear, no judgment, only acknowledgement, like checking off a fact on a list of things she had already accepted about her life. The car turned onto the final stretch before her apartment building. Tate slowed as he always did. The streetlights grew sparse, the buildings lower, the world outside the window settling back into the neighborhood that belonged to June. But June didn't prepare to get out. She sat there, her back still straight, her hands still resting on her lap, her eyes facing forward. She didn't reach for the door handle. She didn't lean toward the exit. There was nothing in her posture that suggested she wanted to end the moment any sooner than usual. Reid noticed. She knew who he was. She knew he was dangerous. She knew his world wasn't hers, and she didn't leave early. She chose to stay exactly the same length of time, not shorter, not longer. As if what he had just said hadn't changed her decision at all. The car stopped. June opened the door, stepped out. She stood outside the car, looking into the darkness inside where Reid sat. "Thank you for driving me home," she said. And for the first time, it didn't sound like a way to settle a debt. It sounded like real gratitude. Then she closed the door, walked away, up the stairs. The apartment door opened and then closed again. Reid remained in the car, watching. Tate didn't ask anything. He simply waited. "Go," Reid said. The car moved forward. And Reid knew that tonight, something had changed between them. Not because June now knew who he was, but because she knew, and still chose not to walk away. In Reid's world, where everyone was either afraid of him or wanted something from him, that choice from June Holloway was the closest thing to trust he had ever been given by someone who didn't belong to his organization. On the other side of the bay, in an old building in downtown Oakland, there was another man still awake at 4 o'clock in the morning. Conway didn't need much sleep. He had lived by the rhythm of the night for 20 years, and in those 20 years, he had built a network that controlled the entire East Bay through patience and an instinctive ability to read people. Conway wasn't stronger than Reid Ashford. He knew that. But he had lived in this world long enough to understand that power wasn't the only thing that could bring a man down. Distraction was the most dangerous thing of all. And Reid Ashford was becoming distracted. The information reached Conway through the web of eyes and ears he had planted across the city. A black car belonging to Reid's people had been appearing regularly near the harbor, parking close to Gentry Restaurant every night, waiting until 4 o'clock in the morning, then following a woman back to an apartment building in the southern part of the city. Not once, not twice, nearly a month. Conway read the report, then set it down. He didn't rush. He never rushed. He simply noted that the man no one on the West Coast dared touch was stopping his car every night for a woman who washed dishes on the night shift, and that was a crack he could use. Not today, but soon. The only thing Conway did for the moment was send a signal, not to Reid, to himself, to mark the fact that he had seen a white flower. Simple, clean, left outside the woman's apartment door at noon, when she was at work, when the child was with the neighbor, when no one was watching. In their world, a white flower needed no explanation. It meant, "I know where you live," nothing more, nothing less. It was only the presence of knowledge. And in this world, knowledge was always the strongest threat. June came home that afternoon after picking Bria up from Miss Pearl. She saw the flower lying outside the door. White petals, stem neatly cut, placed carefully on the doormat, as if someone had set it there with deliberate care. She looked up and down the hallway. Empty. No one there. She picked up the flower and turned it lightly in her hand. No card. No note. No name. June stood there for a few seconds, wondering who might have left flowers for her. Miss Pearl wasn't the type. She wasn't close to the other neighbors. Maybe someone had left it at the wrong door. She gave a faint shrug, stepped inside, took a glass from the kitchen shelf, filled it with water, then put the flower into it and set it on the table. It stood there, white and quiet, in the middle of the small kitchen. That night, June got into the car as usual. She settled into the back seat, closed the door, and for the first time since the two of them had begun having those brief conversations during the ride, she spoke first without needing time to think about it. Something strange happened, she said. Reid looked at her through the rearview mirror. Somebody left flowers outside my door, June said. A white flower. No name. Nothing with it. She said it in an ordinary voice, as if she were mentioning some small detail from the day. The kind of thing a person says and then forgets. But Reid didn't forget. His jaw tightened. Not hard. Not enough for anyone to notice unless they were paying close attention. But Tate noticed. In the rearview mirror, Tate saw the muscle along Reid's jaw lock, saw the hand resting on his thigh tighten for a fraction of a second and then release. Tate knew what a white flower meant, and he knew Reid knew too. I think maybe somebody left it by mistake, June went on. Or maybe it was a neighbor. It doesn't really matter. She gave a small shrug and looked out the window. To her, it was only a flower. Reid said nothing. He didn't ask what kind of flower it was. He didn't ask where exactly it had been left. He didn't ask whether anyone had seen the person who placed it there, because he didn't need to ask. He knew exactly where that flower had come from, who had sent it, and what it meant. Conway had seen. Conway knew June. Conway knew where she lived, and with one white flower placed gently outside the door of a woman who knew nothing about the underworld, Conway was telling Reid that the game had changed. The car moved on in silence for the rest of the drive home. June leaned her head against the glass and closed her eyes, not knowing that the flower she had placed in a glass of water on her kitchen table wasn't a gift. And Reid sat in the front seat, staring straight ahead, his jaw still tight, already calculating every next move in his head, because he knew that from this moment on, June Holloway was no longer only a woman he drove home at night. She had become a target. The next morning, Reid called Tate into his private office. He was standing by the window, his back to the door, looking out over the bay. Tate stepped inside and waited. He knew that when Reid stood like that, staring outside without really seeing anything, something serious was happening. "Pull everyone out of that area," Reid said. "All of them." Tate didn't react right away. He stood still for a second, processing the words in his head. That area meant the Harbor District, the streets around Gentry Restaurant, the apartment building in the south, the entire zone where Reid had kept men watching and guarding for nearly a month without ever saying outright that it was protection. "All of them?" Tate asked. "All of them." Tate drew in a breath. "Conway will take it as you backing down. I don't care what he takes it as." Reid's voice didn't shift. There was no space between the words for Tate to search for hesitation. He said it the way a man reads an order already signed, with nothing left to discuss. Tate stood there for a few more seconds. Then he asked, his voice lower, "What about her?" 2 words. Tate didn't say her name. He didn't need to. Between these two men, there was only one person she could mean. Reid turned around. For the first time during the conversation, he looked at Tate. His eyes were normal. His voice was normal. Everything on his face was normal. But Tate had been beside him for 13 years, and he knew that when Reid Ashford looked completely normal, that was when he was controlling himself the hardest. That was when the inside of him was least normal. "She has nothing to do with me," Reid said. Every word was clear. Final. Without hesitation. Tate looked at him. He didn't nod right away. He held Reid's gaze for 1 second longer, just long enough for both of them to know the statement wasn't true, but also just short enough that neither of them would have to admit it out loud. Then Tate nodded. Understood. He turned and walked out. The door closed. Reid stood alone in the room. He didn't sit down. He didn't look out the window again. He simply stood there in the middle of the office, where he had controlled everything for 13 years, and let the decision settle inside him. Then he returned to his desk, sat down, and opened the next file waiting for him, as if the past month had never happened at all. That night, at 4 o'clock in the morning, June stepped out the back door of Gentry Restaurant. She stood beneath the awning and looked across the street. The place where the black car usually waited was empty. No car, no lights, no one. She stood there longer than necessary, not because she was waiting. June Holloway didn't wait for anyone. She only stood there because her body had grown used to a rhythm. Step outside, look to the right, see the car, then walk. And when that rhythm was broken, her body needed a second to adjust. Only 1 second. Then she started walking, alone. The road home was still as long as it had always been on every night before the black car appeared. She had walked this route hundreds of times. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every street lamp, every alley turn. She didn't need anyone to drive her home. She hadn't needed it before, and she didn't need it now. She walked at an even pace, her back straight, her eyes fixed ahead, without looking back. When she reached the apartment building, she climbed the stairs and stopped at her door. There was no bag of food on the step. She looked down at the spot where, every few days, an unnamed bag of food had usually been left there, empty. She opened the door, stepped inside, and shut it behind her. In the kitchen, the white flower was still standing in a glass of water on the table, its petals beginning to droop, but still white. She looked at it for a second, then walked straight into the bedroom, changed clothes, and got into bed. The next day, no car. The day after that, no car, no food, nothing at all. As if Reid Ashford had never existed in her life, and June didn't ask why. She didn't have his phone number. She didn't know where he lived. She knew nothing about him except his name, his car, and the way he looked at her through the rearview mirror on those silent rides home. She kept living, going to work, coming home, picking up her daughter, paying her debt. Just like before, exactly like before, except that every night, when she stepped out the back door of the restaurant, her eyes still flicked across the street. Just for a second. Then she walked on. 5 days passed. Reid Ashford still sat in that same chair, in that same office, on the highest floor of the building he owned in San Francisco's financial district. Everything functioned as it always had. Reports arrived on time. Decisions were made at the proper moment. His people received orders, carried them out, and reported back. Nothing was late. Nothing was wrong. Because Reid didn't allow anything to be wrong. He handled 3 meetings that day, approved 2 deals, turned down 1 expansion proposal he believed was premature. He read financial reports, checked the numbers, marked the points that needed watching. He did all of it with the precision everyone around him had come to expect, and no one noticed anything different. But every evening, when the top floor slowly emptied, when the light in his office became one of the last lights still glowing on that level, Reid remained in his chair and did nothing. He didn't read. He didn't call anyone. He didn't make plans. He simply sat there. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Tate entered the office with a folder of documents. He set it on the desk and gave a short report on the state of the territories, on a shipment that needed confirmation, on a meeting that had to be arranged for the following week. Reid listened, nodded, gave orders. Everything was normal. Tate gathered the papers and prepared to leave. Then he stopped. His hand rested on the doorknob, but he didn't open it. He stood there for a second, then turned back. "You're not going to her anymore?" Reid didn't look up. His eyes remained on the page in front of him, the pen still in his hand, his posture unchanged. "No, Conway won't stop there," Tate said. His voice wasn't a warning. He didn't need to warn Reid about Conway. Reid understood Conway more clearly than anyone. It was simply a fact Tate placed on the table and left there for Reid to deal with himself. "I know," Reid answered. "Then what are you going to do?" The question hung in the room. Reid stopped his pen. He still didn't look up, but the pen in his hand no longer moved, its tip resting against the paper without writing a thing, only staying there like a period that had not yet found the end of its sentence. The silence stretched for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds. Then Reid spoke. "What I want to do, and what I should do, are 2 different things." The words came slowly, each one separate, heavier than any order he had ever given in that room. Tate stood there. He didn't nod right away. He looked at Reid, at the way he sat motionless with the pen touching the paper without writing, and he understood. Tate had been beside Reid since the earliest days, when the organization had been nothing more than a small group in Western Addition, From before Reid became a name, the whole city was afraid to speak. He had seen Reid make thousands of decisions, every one of them quick, accurate, untouched by emotion. But this was the first time Tate had ever heard Reid admit that there was a distance between what he wanted and what he chose, and that distance had a name. "Understood," Tate said. Then he walked out. The door closed softly. The room returned to silence. Reid set the pen down. He pushed the papers aside, leaned back in his chair, and did nothing. The light above cast its shadow across the dark wood of the desk. Everything in the room was exactly where it belonged. The neatly stacked files to the left, the telephone sitting still to the right, a pen, a glass of water half finished, and one drawer. Reid looked at the drawer on the right side of the desk. He hadn't opened it in a long time, not because he had forgotten, but because he knew exactly what was inside. And each time he opened it, he had to face the only part of his past he had never been able to control. He pulled the drawer open. Inside, it was almost empty. No papers, no documents, only an old photograph, lying face down at the bottom of the drawer, its edges slightly curled with time. He turned the photograph over. His sister. He didn't look for long. He didn't need to. Every line in that photograph had been carved into his memory more deeply than any contract, territory, map, or enemy's face he had ever encountered. He looked at it just long enough to feel it. Then he turned the photograph face down again, slid the drawer shut, and sat back in his chair. Beyond the window, San Francisco was shifting from afternoon into evening. The last light of day was slowly retreating from the bay, giving way to the millions of lights beginning to rise across the city. Somewhere in that city, a woman was getting ready to leave for her night shift, and no car would be waiting for her outside the restaurant at 4 o'clock in the morning anymore. Reid knew that, and he sat there alone, in the office where he controlled everything, except for the one thing he had just chosen to let go. June kept living. Nothing changed. She woke at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, prepared food to leave ready in the refrigerator, picked Bria up from Miss Pearl, fed her, bathed her, told her a story until she fell asleep, then locked the door and left for work at 8:30 in the evening. Miss Pearl came over to sleep beside Bria on the nights June worked. In the morning, June came home, and Miss Pearl returned to her own apartment. That cycle didn't change. It had been running before Reid Ashford appeared, and it kept running after he disappeared. She didn't look for him. She had nothing with which to look. No phone number, no address, not a single connection except a black car and a name her daughter had once pronounced wrong. And she didn't ask anyone. Not because she didn't want to know, but because she had grown used to people arriving and then leaving. And she had learned very early that asking why never brought an answer worth hearing. Every night, at 4 o'clock in the morning, she stepped out the back door of Gentry Restaurant. She stood beneath the awning and looked across the street. Only for a second, fast enough that no one would notice, even fast enough that she herself wouldn't admit she was doing it. Then she looked straight ahead and kept walking. Every night, the same, 1 second glancing to the right, then walking on. The road home was still as long as before. She walked for 40 minutes through familiar streets, past familiar lamps, past familiar alley turns. Her steps were steady, her back was straight, and she didn't stop anywhere along the way. She came home, changed clothes, lay down on the bed, closed her eyes, and tried to sleep before sunrise. But one thing had changed, even though she didn't say it aloud. She was more tired. Not tired from work. Work was still the same. 8 hours of washing dishes, scrubbing pots, cleaning the kitchen. Wages paid on time. Enough to pay debt and buy food for Bria. She was tired in another way, the kind that comes when someone has been present beside you for a while and then suddenly disappears, and the body has to spend extra energy filling in an emptiness it never asked to have created. Miss Pearl noticed. She said nothing. Miss Pearl was the kind of person who saw everything but only spoke when necessary, and she believed it wasn't necessary yet. She only changed one small thing. Every evening when June came home, there was an extra meal waiting on the kitchen table. No note, no explanation. Just a food container with the lid sealed tight, still warm, placed exactly where June would see it when she walked into the kitchen at nearly 5 o'clock in the morning. The first time, June looked at the container, then looked toward the bedroom door, where Miss Pearl was sleeping beside Bria. She said nothing. She sat down, opened the container, and ate. For the first time in many days, She ate a proper meal before going to bed, and that was how June Holloway kept living. No black car, no bags of food left on the doorstep, no one waiting for her outside the restaurant at 4 o'clock in the morning, only Miss Pearl leaving an extra meal on the table without asking, and June finishing every bite without saying thank you. Because between people who have grown used to living with no one, sometimes care doesn't need words. It only needs to be there. Conway waited exactly 2 weeks after Reid pulled his men out of the area. 2 weeks was enough to confirm that Reid wasn't coming back, that the black car no longer appeared near the harbor, that the unofficial protection around that woman had ended. Conway didn't rush. He never rushed. He only needed to know that the road was clear, and once it was clear, he stepped into it. Gentry Restaurant sat on Embarcadero, right inside the territory Conway controlled south of the harbor. The owner was a man who had run the place for nearly 15 years, long enough to understand that in this neighborhood, there were visits a person wasn't allowed to refuse. The visit came in the afternoon, while the restaurant was getting ready for the night shift. 2 men walked in, dressed plainly, sat at a table near the counter, and ordered coffee. They said nothing openly threatening. One of them merely mentioned, in a voice as casual as idle conversation, that the restaurant's business license was coming up for renewal soon, and things in the neighborhood hadn't been especially peaceful lately. The owner listened, nodded, poured them more coffee, and asked no further questions. The 2 men finished their drinks, stood up, and left. No one else in the restaurant paid any attention to that conversation. But the owner understood. He understood as clearly as if they had written it down on paper. That night, June came to work as usual. She changed into her uniform, stepped into the kitchen, and began washing dishes. She had been working for about 2 hours when the manager came downstairs into the kitchen and stood beside her. He said nothing for the first 10 seconds. He only stood there, staring at the kitchen floor, as if trying to arrange the words for a sentence he didn't want to say. "June," he said at last. She turned off the water and looked back at him. "Come up to my office for a minute." She wiped her hands on her apron and followed him upstairs to the manager's office. It was a small room, the desk cluttered with papers, a ceiling fan turning slowly overhead. The manager sat down in his chair, but he didn't look at her. He stared at the desk instead, at a fixed point in the center of it, then said, "We have to cut staff. Today is your last day." The words fell into the room like a stone dropping into still water. June stood there. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't step toward the desk. She only stood still, both hands still damp from dishwater, and asked, "What did I do wrong?" The manager still didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the desk and gave a slight shake of his head. "You didn't do anything wrong." It was the worst answer June could have received, because if she had done something wrong, she could have fixed it. If she had been too slow, she could have worked faster. If she had lacked skill, she could have learned. But when the answer was, "You didn't do anything wrong," it meant there was nothing she could change. The decision had been made somewhere she could never reach, for reasons she would never be allowed to know. June stood there for 3 more seconds. Then she nodded, not in agreement, only in acknowledgement. She turned, went back downstairs to the kitchen, took off her apron, folded it neatly and set it on the shelf, took her handbag from the employee locker, and walked out the back door. Outside, the night was as dark as it always was. But one thing was different. A man was standing beside the door, leaning against the wall, an envelope in his hand. He said nothing. When June stepped out, he simply held the envelope toward her, his face expressionless, then turned and walked away in the opposite direction. Within seconds, he was gone into the dark. June took the envelope. It was light, thin, no name. She stood beneath the restaurant awning, tore one end open, and pulled out what was inside. A photograph. A photograph of the front of her apartment building. At night, taken from across the street, clear enough to show the building number, the staircase, the rusted iron railing, the flickering light bulb on the 2nd floor. There was no note with it, no name, no demand, only the photograph. June's hand trembled. She felt the trembling begin at her fingertips, spread into her wrist, then into her chest. Not fear for herself, but because inside that apartment, at that very moment, her daughter was asleep, and someone had stood outside her home in the night and taken a photograph. She looked at the photograph for 3 more seconds, then she folded it carefully, exactly once down the middle, slipped it into her pocket, and started walking. Her back straight, her eyes fixed ahead, her hand still trembling inside her pocket, but her steps never stopped. The next morning, June began looking for work. She wore the cleanest clothes she owned, a white blouse that had been washed so many times. The fabric had grown thinner than it should have been, dark pants, and the only pair of shoes she had that weren't kitchen shoes. She left the apartment at 9 o'clock in the morning, after dropping Bria off with Miss Pearl, and began walking from one restaurant to another, from one diner to another, from one shop to another. The first place was in the Mission, looking for a server, requiring experience. June said she could learn quickly. The manager asked where she had worked before. She said washing dishes on the night shift. The manager shook his head. The second place was in the Tenderloin, looking for a housekeeper for a small hotel. She filled out an application. They asked for a reference. She didn't have one. They said they would call her. She knew they wouldn't. The third place, the fourth, the fifth. She walked across nearly half the city in a single day. Every place had a reason to turn her away, and every reason was legitimate. No degree, no relevant experience, no reference, no flexible schedule because she had to be home before 6 o'clock in the morning to pick up her daughter. June didn't argue. She thanked them, stepped outside, and went to the next place. She did that for 3 straight days. Every day, she left home at 9 o'clock, left Bria with Miss Pearl, searched for work until afternoon, then came back to pick up her daughter. Every day, she returned empty-handed. No one called back. On the third day, when she opened the mailbox outside the apartment, there was an envelope from the landlord, a notice saying this month's rent was 7 days overdue. If payment wasn't made within the next 14 days, the lease would be terminated. She read the paper, folded it, and slipped it into her pocket. The same pocket where the photograph of the apartment at night was still tucked away. The 2 papers lay side by side. One said that someone knew where she lived. The other said that soon she might not live there anymore. That afternoon, she came home. Miss Pearl was sitting at the kitchen table, and Bria was beside her, coloring. When she heard the door open, Bria looked up, her face lighting at once, and ran over. "Mommy." She wrapped her arms around June's leg and tilted her face up, looking at her mother with the kind of eyes in which everything in the world was still simple and good. "Were you happy today, Mommy?" June looked down at her daughter. Bria was 5 years old, wearing a shirt slightly too large because it had been bought on sale. Her hair tied unevenly because Miss Pearl wasn't used to doing it. Her fingers still marked with wax crayon. The child didn't know her mother had lost her job, didn't know the rent was overdue, didn't know there was a photograph in her mother's pocket that never should have existed. She only knew her mother was home, and she wanted to know whether her mother had been happy today. June bent down and held her. She held her more tightly than usual, long enough that Bria squirmed a little in her arms, and then she smiled. "I was, sweetheart." Her voice was normal, her smile was normal, and Bria believed her, because Bria was 5 years old, and when Mommy said she was happy, then she was happy. June thanked Miss Pearl. The older woman nodded, looked at June for 1 second longer than usual, then stepped out. She didn't ask questions. She knew something was wrong, but she also knew that June wouldn't speak until she was ready, and pressing would only make her close herself more tightly. June shut the door and turned back inside. She fed Bria rice and fried eggs, simple things, whatever was left in the refrigerator. Bria ate with delight, telling stories about being at Miss Pearl's apartment, about the neighbor's cat Miss Pearl had shown her, about how Miss Pearl had taught her to fold towels. June sat across from her, listening, nodding, asking the right questions at the right moments, smiling when she should. She did all of it perfectly, as though nothing inside her were breaking. After dinner, she bathed Bria, changed her into pajamas, lay beside her on the small bed, and told her a story. She told the story of the rabbit looking for a new home, the same story Bria had heard 10 times and still wanted again. June's voice was even, warm, growing slower with the rhythm of Bria's breathing, until the child's eyes closed, until her breathing turned soft and steady, until the little hand clutching her mother's shirt loosened, little by little. June stayed there a few more minutes, watching her daughter sleep. Then she gently slipped her hand free, pulled the blanket up to Bria's chest, and stood. She walked out of the bedroom, crossed the kitchen, and went into the bathroom. She closed the door, locked it, and sat down on the floor. The bathroom tiles were cold beneath her. The white fluorescent light overhead fell straight down on her without mercy, without softness. only brightness. And June Holloway, the woman who had walked home alone at 4 o'clock in the morning for nearly 2 years, the woman who had raised her child alone since her husband died, the woman who had looked directly into Reid Ashford's eyes without stepping back, the woman who had folded the threatening photograph and slipped it into her pocket before walking away with her back straight. That woman sat on the bathroom floor, reached for the hand towel hanging on the rack, pressed it to her mouth, and cried. Not a sound escaped. She didn't let a single noise pass through the towel, because the bedroom was only 1 wall away, and Bria was a very light sleeper. She cried the way she had lived for the past 2 years. Alone, quietly, letting no one see. Tears soaked through the towel, warm and salty against the cloth. Her shoulders shook, her back bent down, for the first time no longer straight, and inside her mind, for the first time since the day her husband died, there was no plan, no next step, no thought that tomorrow would be better. There was only the cold floor, the white light, and the truth that she didn't know what to do anymore. She sat there until the tears ran out. Not because she felt better, but because the body runs out of tears before pain runs out. Then she lowered the towel, stood up, turned on the faucet, washed her face, looked into the mirror. Her eyes were red, her nose was red, but she still looked straight into her own eyes in the glass, as if checking whether the woman on the other side was still standing. She was. June turned off the water, dried her face, opened the bathroom door, stepped out. Bria was still asleep. The apartment was still quiet, and life still had to go on. Tate didn't knock. He walked straight into Reid's office, closed the door behind him, and stood there. Reid was seated at his desk, a file open in front of him, a pen in his hand. He looked up. Tate never entered without knocking unless something was wrong. "You need to know this," Tate said. Reid set the pen down. Tate spoke briefly, in the same way he always gave a report. Nothing extra, nothing missing. Conway had leaned on the owner of Gentry Restaurant. June Holloway had been fired. That same night, an envelope had been handed directly to her just outside the restaurant door. Inside was a photograph of the front of her apartment building, taken at night. Tate stopped there. He didn't need to say anything more. Both of them understood what that photograph meant. Reid sat motionless, his hand rested on the desk, his fingers unmoving, his eyes unblinking. Silence, but not the kind of silence Tate was used to. The silence that came when Reid was thinking had a lighter quality to it, a rhythm, movement beneath the surface. This silence was different. It was heavy. Still, it was like the flat surface of water, just before something enormous rises from underneath. Tate had been beside Reid long enough to know that this kind of silence was more dangerous than any order Reid had ever spoken aloud. "Was she hurt?" Reid asked. His voice was normal, low, even, but in 13 years at Reid's side, this was the first time Tate had ever heard him ask a question whose answer had nothing to do with the organization, nothing to do with money, nothing to do with power. It had to do with a person. "She lost the job," Tate answered, "and she's close to losing the apartment." Reid stood up. Not fast, not slow. He rose from the chair with the same control he brought to everything else, but Tate saw his hand tighten as it left the desk, clenched, then open again. "You want Conway handled?" Tate asked. Reid looked out at the window. San Francisco stretched below, normal, shining, unaware of the conversation happening on the top floor of this building. "No," Reid said. "I won't want him ended." Tate nodded. He didn't ask another question. He turned and left to make preparations. Reid didn't need force. He never had, at least not in the wars that mattered. Force was the tool of men with no other options. Reid always had another option. He had information. For 13 years, Reid had built an intelligence network broader than any organization on the West Coast. He knew who owed what to whom, who was hiding what, who was working with whom without wanting the world to know. And Conway, no matter how careful he was, wasn't an exception. Reid held proof of the dealings Conway wanted buried, the secret arrangements between Conway and a city official, the kind of arrangements that, if exposed, wouldn't only drag Conway down, but would drag down the men who had protected him for the last 20 years as well. That evidence was enough to make federal investigators open a case, enough to collapse the entire structure Conway had spent 2 decades building. Reid had kept that evidence as a reserve card, something he had never needed to use. Until now. The meeting happened the following afternoon. No one chose the location. It simply happened in the way meetings between men like Reid and Conway always happened, in neutral ground. A restaurant closed during the afternoon in North Beach, a table set in the back, no cameras, no staff, only two men seated across from each other. Conway arrived first. He sat there at ease, one leg crossed over the other, his hands on the table, as if this were nothing more than a social meeting between two men in the same trade. Reid stepped in and sat down. No handshake, no greeting. He placed an envelope on the table and slid it across to Conway. Conway looked at the envelope, then at Reid. He didn't open it at once. He looked into Reid's eyes, searching for something. A sign, a crack, a weakness. But Reid's eyes gave him nothing. They were flat, cold, and patient in the way only a man who truly holds power can afford to be patient. Conway opened the envelope. Inside were copies of documents he had believed no one knew existed. Names, dates, amounts, recipients. He skimmed the pages, his expression unchanged, but the fingers holding the paper went stiff. "Pull out of the entire southern harbor area," Reid said. "Don't touch anyone under my protection. Not directly, not indirectly, not through someone else." Conway looked up. "And if I don't?" 24 hours, Reid said. "After that, the evidence goes places you don't want it to go, and this conversation will be the last conversation you have with anyone outside a prison cell." Conway remained seated for another 10 seconds. His eyes moved back to the documents, then to Reid, then to the documents again. There was nothing to negotiate, nothing to bluff. This wasn't a threat. It was truth laid on the table in black and white, and both men knew it. Conway stood. He didn't say another word. He only looked at Reid one last time, then turned and walked out. The door closed behind him. Reid sat alone in the empty restaurant. He didn't let out a breath of relief. He didn't smile. He simply sat there with both hands on the table, staring at the empty chair across from him, knowing Conway would withdraw. Not because Conway was afraid of him, but because Conway was afraid of what Reid held in his hands. Then Reid stood, walked outside. Tate was waiting by the car. "Done?" Tate asked. "Done," Reid answered. The car pulled away. But Reid knew done was only half the truth. Conway had withdrawn, but June still had no job. She was still close to losing her apartment, and he was still the man who had disappeared without a word. Reid came to June's apartment in the afternoon. He drove himself, alone, with no Tate, no one else. For the first time in many years, he was driving his own car. He parked a few yards from the building, stepped out, and climbed the stairs. Each footstep on the iron steps rang out in the stillness of the afternoon. He stopped in front of the apartment door. It was slightly open, enough for him to hear what was happening inside. The sound of packing tape being pulled, the sound of objects being set into boxes, the sound of someone getting ready to leave. He knocked. The noise inside stopped. Footsteps came closer. The door opened. June stood there, her hair tied up high, an old shirt on, tape still sticking to her fingers. Behind her, the small apartment was being taken apart piece by piece, belongings packed into cardboard boxes. The bookshelf empty, the kitchen table holding only the glass where the white flower had withered and dried. She looked at him. He looked at her. No one spoke. The silence stretched between them, heavier than any conversation they had ever had in the car, because in the car, they had been able to look ahead and pretend that the space between two rows of seats was reason enough not to tell the truth. But now, standing face to face, with no rearview mirror, no car windows, no darkness, only the late afternoon light cutting through the apartment, and two people looking directly at each other, there was nowhere left to hide. June spoke first. "You disappeared without a word." Her voice wasn't angry. It wasn't accusing. It was simply the truth, spoken in the voice of someone who had carried it inside for long enough and no longer wanted to carry it alone. Reid looked at her. He said nothing. 4 weeks, June continued. Not one word. Reid still held her gaze. His eyes didn't shift, didn't waver, but they weren't cold the way they had been before. There was something behind them that June had never seen, or that he had never allowed her to see. She stood there, one hand still holding the roll of tape, the other hanging loose at her side. Then she spoke again. Her voice was calm, but trembling, not in volume, in rhythm, in the space between words, in the way she had to draw breath before each sentence, as if she had to hold herself together before the truth slipped free. Do you know what the worst part was? It wasn't losing my job. It wasn't almost losing my home. The worst part was that I started getting used to you being there. Then you disappeared. And I realized I had let a stranger become important to me. That was the most frightening part. Those words fell into the apartment and stayed there. They didn't need to be repeated. They didn't need explanation. They simply lay there between them, true and heavy. Reid stood in the doorway. He didn't step inside. He didn't defend himself. He didn't say, I had my reasons. He didn't say, I did it for you. He simply stood there, took in every word, and let them strike exactly where they were meant to strike. Then he spoke. Slowly, one word at a time. I disappeared because the last time I failed to protect someone important, that person didn't survive. He stopped, drew in a breath. I didn't want you to become the next one. That was all. He said nothing more. He didn't speak his sister's name. He didn't explain what had happened. He didn't explain 13 years. Just those 2 sentences. But those 2 sentences held more than everything he had said to anyone since the night his sister died. It was the first time Reid Ashford had spoken of it to someone outside the organization. The first time he had allowed someone who didn't belong to his world to look into the one place he kept hidden deeper than business secrets, deeper than deals, deeper than the name the whole city feared to speak. June stopped moving. The roll of tape lowered in her hand. She looked at him, and for the first time, she didn't see the black car, didn't see the dark coat, didn't see the man all of San Francisco feared. She saw someone standing at her door who had driven himself there, alone, and had just spoken aloud the thing he hadn't spoken to anyone in 13 years. She understood. Not the details, not the whole story, but the reason. She understood why he had come every night. She understood why he had disappeared. She understood why he was standing here now. Everything began and ended in the same place. He had lost someone, and he was trying not to lose someone else. The 2 of them stood there. No one stepped forward. No one stepped back. The distance between them remained the same, an arm's length, maybe 2. But it no longer felt like distance. It no longer felt like defense, caution, or the pride of 2 people used to living alone. It was truth, and truth doesn't need to be shortened. It only needs to be seen. June looked at him for another moment. Then she said, her voice softer now, no longer trembling, You came too late. Reid looked at her. I know. It was the only time he said those 2 words during this conversation, and they carried an entirely different meaning from every other time he had ever said them before. It wasn't acknowledgement of information. It was acknowledgement of fault. Reid didn't give June money. He knew she wouldn't take it. And even if she did, it would break the one thing she still had left after everything that had happened. The dignity of a woman who took care of herself and her child with her own 2 hands. He understood that, because many years earlier, he had been that kind of person too, when he had nothing except himself and a younger sister who needed protecting. So he did it another way. Within the network Reid controlled, there were many legitimate businesses. Restaurants, real estate, transportation, the kind of things that floated above the surface, clean, legal, existing to create a respectable shell for what moved beneath the waterline. One of those restaurants needed someone. Reid didn't call the restaurant manager. He spoke to Tate. Tate arranged it. No trace was left connecting June Holloway to Reid Ashford. There was simply a position that opened at exactly the right moment, with requirements that fit her, a shift ending before 5 o'clock in the morning, wages enough to cover rent and hospital payments, and no need for a reference. 3 days after the conversation at her apartment door, June received a phone call. A restaurant in the marina wanted to interview her for a kitchen assistant position. She went. She was hired on the spot during the interview. The manager said her kitchen experience was sufficient, and they needed someone urgently. Everything went so smoothly it didn't feel natural. And June knew. She wasn't foolish. A woman with no degree, no references, fired from her previous job without explanation, suddenly getting called by a restaurant in the marina and hired the same day. She knew whose hand was behind that. That night, Reid came. Not in the black car. He walked to the apartment building alone and knocked. June opened the door. She stood in the doorway, looked at him, and said it plainly. The restaurant in the marina. Reid didn't deny it. He didn't nod. He simply stood there, looked at her, and waited. June held his gaze longer than usual. Then she said, I took it because of my daughter, not because of you. That's up to you, Reid replied. There was nothing romantic in that exchange. No softened looks, no step closer. Only two adults standing on opposite sides of a threshold, trying to find a way to exist beside one another without either of them having to bow their head. June needed the job because she needed to feed her daughter. Reid had made that job possible because he had the means to do it. And both of them accepted that this wasn't charity, and it wasn't a favor. It was only an unspoken agreement between two people who had seen the bottom of each other and had not turned away. June gave a small nod. Then she added, her voice calm, "I'll pay it all back when I can. Every bit of it." "That's up to you," Reid said again. It was the only answer he needed to give, because it placed the choice in June's hands, exactly where it belonged. He didn't need her gratitude. He didn't need her to soften. He only needed her to still be there, still standing straight, still the woman he had seen on the sidewalk that night, limping but never stopping. June closed the door. Reid walked back down the stairs. On the way home, he called Tate. "There's work to do," he said. "Review everything. All of it. Every operation in the Southern District. Anything that's directly harming the people living there, cut it." Silence on the other end of the line, longer than usual. Then Tate said, "You're serious?" "Have I ever spoken in jest?" Reid asked. Tate didn't answer that, because the answer was obvious. In 13 years, Reid Ashford had never said a single word he didn't mean to carry out. "Understood," Tate said. Then he ended the call. Reid slipped the phone back into his coat pocket and kept walking down the sidewalk. Night had fallen. San Francisco was lit all around him, familiar, unchanging, still the same city he had controlled for 13 years. But he no longer looked at it the same way. He no longer looked at anything the same way, because now, whenever he looked at the system he had built, he no longer saw only structure and numbers. He saw roughened hands, long walks home at 4 o'clock in the morning, people bent over kitchen sinks beneath fluorescent lights while their children slept at home. He wasn't a good man. He knew that, but he was beginning to become a less terrible one. And sometimes, that is all a man can do. On Sunday morning, Reid came to June's apartment building. He drove himself, parked on the corner, and stepped out. It was daylight. This was the first time he had come here during the day. Every time before had been at night, in darkness, in the kind of world untouched by light. But this morning, the early sun lay across the front of the apartment building, and everything looked different, smaller, more real. He climbed the stairs and stopped at the door. Knocked. Small footsteps came running from inside, quick and light, the kind of footsteps only a child could make. The door opened. Bria stood there, star-patterned pajamas, hair tousled, eyes still a little sleepy but lighting up the moment she saw who was outside. She tilted her head and looked up at him in exactly the same way she had looked at him in the car that night months ago, when she said something he hadn't known how to answer. "Are you sad again?" she asked. Reid looked down at her, the child from the sidewalk that night, the child who had held her mother's hand and matched her mother's pace, the child who had said, "Let's ask that man to help you." Mommy was now standing in front of him barefoot, on the floor, hair a mess, still looking at him with those same fearless eyes. He almost smiled. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved just a little, but enough. Enough for Bria to notice. "Not today," he said. Bria smiled. Then she reached out, took his hand, and pulled. "Come in. Mommy's making breakfast." Reid let her pull him across the threshold, her small hand wrapped around two of his fingers, firm and natural, as if this were something she did every day. The apartment was brighter in daylight. The kitchen window stood open and sunlight poured in. The cardboard boxes were gone. The bookshelf held books again. The kitchen table had 3 plates on it. June stood in the kitchen with her back to the door. She was setting a plate of toast on the table when she heard footsteps. She turned around, saw Reid standing in the kitchen doorway with Bria tugging on his hand, looking out of place in the small room, in the way people used to large spaces always look out of place when they stand somewhere that fits too closely around them. She didn't say anything. She only gave a small nod, and that was enough. The 3 of them sat down at the table. Breakfast was simple. Toast, eggs, orange juice, nothing special. But Reid couldn't remember the last time he had sat at a table to eat for any reason that wasn't work. Bria talked without stopping. She told him about Miss Pearl's neighbor's cat, about a friend from class, about a dream she had the night before but couldn't remember the ending of. She talked in the voice of a 5-year-old child for whom everything in the world was worth telling, and she told it all to Reid, as if he had been sitting at this table every Sunday morning for the past year. Reid listened. He didn't nod just to be polite. He listened for real. For the first time in many years, he sat still and listened to someone talk without calculating, without analyzing, without searching for a hidden intention behind every sentence. He just listened, and sometimes he asked questions. What color was the cat? And then what happened? Bria's eyes brightened every time he asked, because she knew that asking questions meant he was truly listening. June sat across from them, eating slowly, watching the two of them. She didn't say much. She only watched her daughter talking to the man she hadn't wanted to get into the car months ago. And for the first time, she didn't hide her smile. It was slight. It was brief. But it was there. After breakfast, Bria ran into the bedroom and came back with a drawing pad and a box of crayons. She sat down at the table, bent over her paper, and began to draw. Reid sat across from her, watching her pull each crayon line over the page, pressing harder in the places that mattered, and more lightly in the places that didn't, all by instinct. A few minutes later, Bria looked up and turned the paper toward Reid. 3 people standing side by side. No names, no labels, just 3 figures. 1 tall, 1 medium, 1 small, standing close together on a single line Bria had drawn as the ground beneath them. Reid looked at the drawing. He looked at it longer than he had looked at any document in his life. His hand resting at the edge of the table tightened slightly, just enough for the knuckles to turn a little paler. June looked at his hand, then at his eyes, and she understood. No one needed to say anything. Reid stood. He took his coat from the back of the chair and put it on. Bria looked up from her drawing. Are you leaving? Yeah. Will you come back? The question came lightly, simply, carrying no weight except the curiosity of a 5-year-old child who wanted to know whether someone she liked talking to would return. Reid looked at her, then at June. June stood beside the table, her hand resting on the back of a chair, watching him. She didn't nod, didn't shake her head. She only looked at him and let him decide for himself. I will, Reid said. 1 word, but it was steadier than every promise he had made in any negotiation over the past 13 years. He stepped out the door, down the stairs, out to the street. Tate was waiting in the car. He opened the door and sat in the back seat. Back to the office? Tate asked. Reid didn't answer right away. He looked in the rearview mirror, the small apartment behind them, the iron staircase, the kitchen window standing open, sunlight bright on the faded wall. He kept looking until the car began to move. Yeah, he said. The car turned onto the main road. San Francisco opened up ahead, wide and bright, the same city he had controlled for 13 years. But Reid Ashford knew that for the first time in 13 years, he wasn't only leaving, he had somewhere to return to. If this story touched your heart, please press like and share it with the people you love. We'd love to hear what you truly feel, so leave a comment and let us know how this story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the next stories we share each day. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.